Right. Well, Kenny, why don't you start by giving us your name and title, and let me know if you want me to call you Kenny or Dr. Wallen.
Kenny's fine. It's no worries. So I'm at the University of Arkansas. I have an appointment within the Division of Agriculture here and the Arkansas Forest Resources Center. So I'm an assistant professor currently. Um, I specialize in social psychology, conservation, environmental psychology, and behavior change approaches within that sphere.
How'd you end up getting into this discipline in particular?
So my undergrad degree is actually in psychology, but then I specialized a lot in undergrad, doing research with mammalogy and some ecology type research, and then I parlayed that into a master's degree in zoology, actually. Um, and then I decided, after discovering that there was a field in which those are sort of merged, I wanted to get a PhD in that, and so that's why I went ahead and got a PhD in human dimensions and natural resources, and that's where I find myself right now, teaching and sort of doing research in that realm.
Well, yeah, I'm hoping we can talk a bit today about conservation marketing and some of the applications there. I know you're someone obviously who's involved in this field on the research side, and maybe we can start off by having you explain to students here what is conservation marketing and how is that distinct and build upon social marketing?
Yeah. So one of the things I try to start with when I'm explaining this to anyone really is the idea that conservation, first and foremost, is a field of practice. So, we bring in and apply principles and strategies, concepts, methods from other disciplines and fields of practice or approaches from other sectors to achieve that goal of preserving, conserving, or sustaining a natural resource, biodiversity, or socio-environmental interactions. So when I define it like that, especially when we're talking about social environmental interactions, we're talking about people, we're talking about behavior and the choices that they make. So conservation marketing, in turn, is kind of the application of scientifically supported marketing and social marketing techniques and strategies, and we base those on building relationships among your audience and whoever's trying to enact the behavior change, and social exchange, storytelling, and ultimately leading us to that conservation goal of behavior change. So that's sort of my definition of it and how I try to explain it to people. The field itself has a formal definition of conservation marketing, which is the ethical application of marketing strategies, concepts, and techniques to influence those attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors of individuals and societies, with the objective of advancing conservation goals. So, whether it's my definition or our formal definition, the idea is that conservation ultimately begins and ends with behavior, and using marketing, social marketing, and now conservation marketing tools and approaches is one way to get at behavior change.
And this is a relatively new or fresh field. So yeah, I mean, what for you is kind of exciting, or where do you see kind of the frontiers here in terms of research and practice?
Yeah, the idea with conservation marketing is it's really bringing to the forefront the idea that behavior is focal, that we really, really need to begin focusing specifically on behaviors, or bundles of behaviors, and putting that in the forefront. So oftentimes in marketing or social marketing, they're trying to sell something. So in marketing, it's a product to a consumer. In social marketing, it's a social good to an individual or group. And in conservation marketing, it's that conservation outcome or goal. And with that in mind, we pull in a lot of different advances in the fields of marketing, social marketing, behavior change in general. One of the most interesting things that's happening right now is the idea of evaluation and defining success with that evaluation aspect. So how are things actually working? We spend a lot of money on outreach, on marketing. Organizations like Wild Aid spend tons of money promoting efforts to limit or mitigate illegal wildlife trade. with celebrity endorsements or any type of messaging strategies. And we really are now with bringing in sort of the concepts and approaches from marketing and social marketing, focusing on how we can go about evaluating the effectiveness of those for the conservation outcomes that we want. And then also through this iterative process that is sort of the social marketing process, redefining what we mean by success, or at the beginning defining what success is and recognizing when we succeed or when we fail. Those are some big ones. That's sort of a big overarching advance or sort of frontier that I'm excited about. There's a lot of specific stuff that's going on. If you want me to get into that in terms of specific types of research or projects that I know people are doing that are really fun.
Yeah, that's great, and yeah, we'll read a few of those papers that are looking at those aspects now of paying attention to evaluation. Yeah, I mean, if you have a specific example that you think is pretty illustrative, or that would be great, or
Yeah,
some fun research. Yeah.
yeah. So I have a colleague up at University of Montana, Alex Metcalf. He is doing some interesting, we call it micro targeting. So it's this idea that we pulled, not we, but Alex and his team have pulled from the campaigns, so political campaigns, election campaigns, thinking about how we can build profiles of individuals that are likely to do X, Y, Z that benefits conservation or leads to some conservation objective or outcome that we have in mind. So we identify first and foremost people who have done that target behavior in the past. And so we collect known attributes about them. Maybe it's consumer behavior, or maybe it's their social media activity. Um, it kind of sounds bad now that we've had all this news with Facebook and stuff like that. But there's so much information out there about your behavior, and oftentimes that can lead us to some type of profile of individuals that we see similarities between them. So maybe we have that profile. We build that profile based on individuals who have done the behavior in the past, and now we can use that information to identify individuals who haven't done that behavior in the past but have the same profile. So then we can begin being a little bit more efficient with how we go about um, if we're doing any type of messaging, or if we're doing any type of campaigning, promotions, or trying to get people to. Alex's research was on conservation easements. So how can we identify people who are more likely to be interested in giving a conservation easement for a particular riparian zone or something like that? And I think that's really interesting, and it's a great example of how we pull from established methods in marketing and social marketing and apply it to the context of conservation or any type of environmental sustainability, natural resource avenue. And that one's really exciting. He just presented that this summer, and he's hoping to get that published soon. And that should be a really good one. And so that's one of the big ones I'm excited for other people. And then things that I'm doing are actually a little bit more straightforward. I'm just doing some basic conservation, not conservation marketing, but yeah, specifically social marketing techniques for conservation here in Arkansas with our feral hog problem. We have this interesting dynamic of the University of Arkansas's mascot is a razorback, which is a feral hog, and people love it. That's how they recognize Arkansas, University of Arkansas. So anytime you're trying to deal with feral hog issues, you're always going to come up against, oh, well, we like hogs here, but we have to flip it and say we like this hog, but we don't like this hog. So we're trying to understand what type of messaging or social marketing campaigns, infographics, visuals that we can use, catchphrases like "not my hog" or something like that, or the thing we're trying to do is we're trying to reterm the idea that there's the Razorback, which is the University of Arkansas mascot, and then we have feral hogs. But we're trying to we're doing some focus groups to try to figure out what name we could use for feral hogs. Something like, so it's combining the idea of a swine and a hog and terming it a swag, and creating sort of an alternative mascot to that. And so that way when we talk about feral hogs, we can avoid any kind of conflating with the University of Arkansas mascot, and we can talk about our swag instead. But these are really in early developmental stage, and we're doing focus groups and pilot tests and stuff like that. But again, we pull on those methods and approaches from social marketing to sort of build that and try to see what actually works, rather than assuming we know what works.
Yeah, those are two good ones. Yeah, the research of Dr. Metcalf I think is really fascinating. I haven't spoken with him a little bit, and yeah, I think what you're describing, I'm sure a lot of practitioners as well as researchers, that's a pretty typical, challenge there, and kind of yeah, sometimes getting people to recognize yeah something they identify with might be invasive or otherwise destructive or something like that, and yeah, as you mentioned, I think. Yeah, obviously, obviously a pretty major state symbol for Arkansas as well. And you bring up a question. Some of the, I think, kind of fundamental papers on conservation marketing touched on that idea you just mentioned of, things like branding and using these traditional marketing tools. And early on in some of those papers, there was kind of this question of how willingly or how comfortable conservation practitioners and researchers are with marketing principles and tools. So, in your experience, do you see some of those barriers, or do you feel like researchers like yourself and practitioners, are learning to embrace marketing tools that have been associated, let's say, with corporate, or commercial, growth, that kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely some barriers and some hesitancy, particularly you know as I sort of framed conservation as this field of practice and being behavior focused, and we need to emphasize that it's people and people's actions that we need to focus on. That doesn't necessarily come to that's not necessarily the first thing that comes to people's minds when they think about conservation. Um, so that's sort of my job, is really, if I can get that framing to sit with someone and stew, and then they recognize, oh yeah, okay, yeah, behavior, people, decisions, actions, those types of things are important. And then we sort of bring in sort of this idea that, okay, so if we have that in place, then why wouldn't we use established and proven methods and approaches, strategies, whatever you want to call them, that do impact behavior in some way? And so when you start talking about marketing and social marketing and branding and all that type of stuff, um, in that framing, that really strikes a chord with them. So it's really a little bit of front end work to try to orient them towards that idea of conservation, more or less being a combination of, yes, what they know in the past of natural science, ecology, biodiversity conservation, that realm, all the sort of ologies, mammalogy, herpetology, that type of stuff, but then also making them realize that at the end of the day, people are really the movers and shakers of what's going to benefit conservation outcomes positively. But yeah, there is a lot of stuff like that. Sometimes you get people who have the stereotypical, like, marketers or snake oil salesmen and that type of thing, just trying to sell you something. At the end of the day, that's what we are trying to do, but we're trying to sell you a good. And so that's a lot of the difference between, first and foremost, marketing and social marketing. But then also taking that social marketing framing, that we're doing it for a social good, and making it specific to conservation contexts or conservation outcomes. But yeah, there's a it's not the first thing that comes to people's minds, and so there's a little bit of a barrier there. But once you get people to understand that conservation marketing itself is a mode of behavior change, then they're like, okay, cool. Then they want to hear what you have to say, and then they want to, some of the papers that you've mentioned, sort of like what Diogo Berarcimio has been doing with the evaluation. They're, oh, wow, okay, I see, this is effective, or oh, this isn't effective. Okay, great. And so they see some evidence of it working, which is what you really, really need.
Great. Well, we'll read the paper you co-authored with Elizabeth Doubt in our program here, and you cover some other, pretty big frameworks and concepts that I'm hoping you can also kind of elaborate on for students. So, one of the ones you mentioned, obviously, is human-centered design and how it incorporates empathy, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and how that might be a useful framework for folks who might be looking to apply conservation marketing projects and tools.
Yeah, so the idea with human-centered design is that we don't necessarily, as conservation researchers or practitioners or managers, have the same focus or goals or objectives as the individuals at the community level that might need some type of help changing behaviors or some type of intervention or something like that. So what that whole focus on empathy is trying to do is shift focus from what to conserve or how to conserve it to more or less what are the fundamental needs of those community members or those stakeholders, and what needs are met by the behavior that we're trying to change, and then what could be some alternatives to that. So we're really sort of becoming this more user-centered framework. It's something that we pull from um, participatory action research. It's a method that's used extensively in, as silly as it sounds, in application software development, that type of stuff where you're trying to, oh, what does the user need, right? So how do we go about doing that? So it's this idea that we are not trying to bring in things from the outside. Like social marketing has specific methods, approaches, more or less canned methods or strategies. With human-centered design, we're not assuming that some exogenous methodology or orientation is going to work. We really want to get in this, and so we take this more, what I would term endogenous approach, this more inside the community or inside the context approach to see the perspective of the users or the stakeholders to really understand what they need. And through that whole process, the greatest thing about human-centered design frameworks is that the individuals are involved, right? You're working with them day to day, and you're sort of iterating and prototyping what works, what doesn't work. I use this approach for like little things. Like it's really funny here at my work. It's a typical university setting, office dynamics and conflicts and little piddly things that really, really get in the way and take up a lot of times at faculty meetings, for example. And we had this one interesting issue where we were trying to sign out vehicles to use for research, for field work and stuff like that. And so it was like originally it was like a notebook or something like that. And it was really becoming cumbersome with the number of people. And so I just said, hey, why don't we see what works? Because everybody had a different idea of what worked. So we've tried like 3 or 4 different things, and it happened over the course of like 2 months. This didn't work, so we changed it. So this didn't work, we changed it. And finally, we came to something that worked. And so we just iterated on it. What parts of this worked and were beneficial? What parts didn't work? Okay, how can we incorporate that into the next, quote unquote, prototype or the next stage? But it's working day in and day out with the people who are using the product or the whatever resource it is. And so it's really about, focusing on we don't really know what to do yet. So we want to work with individuals that are going to somehow benefit or implement the strategy. So that's one of the big things. Like when we leave as researchers or practitioners, these communities or something like that, the individuals we leave, the community members that we leave, have to implement this, have to carry it forward and sustain it over time. So we really want it to be theirs. And so that's sort of that idea of empathy with the human-centered design process is we make it theirs, and we just hopefully our expertise can help, but we don't assume that our expertise is really the only thing that matters.
Great. And then, as well, obviously, you also cover theory of change. Students in this class will read some of the materials from Rare, where they obviously have developed that idea. But yeah, if you can talk about that as well in its value as a decision support tool, and yeah, again, how it can be deployed.
Yeah, theory of change is one of the most powerful tools I think that we have for anything when you're doing any type of program development. It's kind of an extension. If any of your students or anyone that is familiar with extension work, people who work in extension, cooperative extension units, it's similar to what we call a logic model in that world. But it's this idea that we want to outline everything that's going to happen for a program. And so the difference between theory of change and what you might read from a logic model paper is that with theory of change, we start with the behavior. Like, so I've kind of emphasized that behavior is really focal. And with theory of change, we want to start with, whether it's the program outcome or whether it's a specific behavior, particularly when we're talking about conservation marketing, it really is that behavior. So we start with the behavior and we actually work backwards. So we want to say, okay, what do we need to reach this desired behavior? Is it, changing values or attitudes, or is it more, maybe we need sort of a technological fix? Maybe we need to provide some type of communication. Maybe we need to fix some type of public policy issue. But it's sort of describing how this program is actually going to work, starting with behavior and how it's going to work at all sorts of different steps. So if you're looking at Rare's theory of change, it's really interesting. And that's the first thing that they'll start with is like, hey, we start backwards and we sort of work through that sort of linear process. But the interesting thing is you also, with you're doing a full-on theory of change, you're trying to find causal linkages between those sequences or those actions that you've sort of described. So how is this going to help with this? So when you're doing sort of an education-focused outreach or intervention, as I outlined in our paper, like education doesn't always work. And we know that when it works best is when someone has that intrinsic motivation or that internal motivation to learn. And so that would be an assumption that we put in our theory of change. Okay, our outcome is going to be improved education or increased knowledge base or something like that. But within that theory of change, we have to have, okay, we can't assume that everybody has that intrinsic motivation to learn or wanting to learn. So we need to put that in our model, and somehow we need to set some mechanism as a causal linkage. Okay, if we increase that intrinsic motivation, it will increase our education or knowledge outcome by this much. So it's sort of setting up those necessary and sufficient preconditions to explain or predict that conservation outcome or that behavior outcome that we want. And it really, in my mind, what it really is great about it is it promotes that sort of causal or cause and effect thinking. Okay, if we do this, it's going to cause this, and if we do this, it's going to cause this, and trying to put that sort of in a at the end of the day, it's a conceptual map.
Yeah,
So,
it's pretty interesting, and it's helpful to hear you talk about it as well versus reading about it. I think, yeah, I mean, obviously, Rare does a good job with some of its diagrams, but yeah, I think you speaking to that point of how it kind of works backwards, I think is a great way of framing that in our minds.
yeah, and it's interesting for me, like in my work, a lot of times with psychology, and we do a lot of path analysis. So we're making path models, and if your students are learning about like theory of planned behavior or value belief norm theory or something like that, it's always, or even like cognitive hierarchy, like a lot of the researchers in HDNR at Colorado State work under. It starts with a lot of values and beliefs and norms and attitudes, and then tries to predict behavior. Instead, theory of change works backwards because the first and foremost, we're worried about behavior. So we want to know what caused that behavior and what might cause the change in a behavior. So thinking about behavior first and foremost, that's what I really love about theory of change, is that it really, really flips your way of thinking about stuff, and it really leads to different directions. So because you're like, oh, well, maybe in this case, attitudes don't matter or values don't matter. Maybe it's a policy, maybe it's some structural elements, or maybe it's really just some geographical barrier. Maybe it's distance to water or something like that. So thinking more broadly and systematically about stuff.
Great. Well, last question here for now is again, I referenced the paper you co-authored that looks at some of these through the lens of the illegal wildlife trade. So yeah, I mean, how in terms of maybe applying some of these concepts to that general field? Yeah, I mean, where do you see kind of applications there?
Yeah, so conservation marketing in general that's been one of our, I guess, main issues that a lot of researchers have been approaching or using conservation marketing principles, social marketing principles to address is illegal wildlife trade. And that's some of that evaluation stuff that I mentioned earlier, trying to understand the effectiveness of certain campaigns and how we might improve that, particularly thinking about demand. So demand for illegal wildlife products is a behavior. So it's that consumer purchasing behavior. So it really ties in with a lot of the marketing principles, the branding, and that type of stuff. So whether it's positively branding a species, so that people have some type of emotional link to it, to where they don't want to buy products associated with that. And that's an approach that Rare takes a lot with their Pride campaigns, is that emotional linkage and trying to understand the effectiveness of that. Others, again, are looking at how do celebrity endorsers actually influence behavior. And it's actually really interesting. At least some of the stuff that I've read is the idea of like Prince William or David Beckham. Nobody really cares in some contexts, particularly like in Southeast Asia or China, about them as ambassadors or endorsing or something like that. But you throw in Yao Ming or Jackie Chan, and you have a much, much better response. So simple principles like that, oh, cultural context, yes, that makes sense. So that's something that's happened with Wild Aid. There's another organization, Education for Nature Vietnam, does that same thing, where they use a lot of more local ambassadors to endorse or to help promote reduction of illegal wildlife product purchasing. Um, so that's one interesting thing in terms of marketing principles and using that evaluation approach and that iteration approach. Another one is the theory of change. I think it was Dan McCallender. I can't remember who that was. They had a nice paper in, I believe it was Conservation Letters or Conservation Biology, talking about theory of change for reducing demand for illegal wildlife products. And that was interesting because they took a very broad perspective on that theory of change and sort of walked through different mechanisms um, to see sort of just the whole system and where certain interventions might be needed, where sort of are these crux or linchpin points that can really affect or have high impact on the demand reduction for illegal wildlife. The organization Traffic has done some similar stuff like that, where they not explicitly theory of change, but they've developed sort of maps, conceptual maps of how that whole system of illegal wildlife change starts from supplier to intermediary to purchaser, and looking at well, where can we make some specific impacts, or where is the point in which we can have the biggest impact for the or efficiency, or what's the biggest impact for the least amount of money. So that's kind of where that theory of change comes in. Other interests, I haven't seen anything in particular with human-centered design, and I might just be out of the loop on some of those things. I know it's becoming more common for people to think about it that way, particularly when it comes to right now. There's been some recent conferences on illegal wildlife trade. I think Oxford just had one. But they're talking about sort of the gender issues with illegal wildlife trade, and that's maybe where human-centered design fits in, is understanding that how important it is to get women and young women involved in sort of this system, and seeing how we can help meet their needs and help get them more prominent positions within the system of influence, to either from a marketing perspective, branding perspective, or on the ground as block leaders or social influencers or something like that. But really trying to understand what types of barriers culturally do they have in terms of becoming, whether they're in a patriarchy, and how do they become more influential. So those are some interesting, I think, frontiers that might be of interest to your students, or anyone who is really of interested in learning more about how illegal wildlife trade and conservation marketing and all this behavior change stuff really fits together, because it's one of those systems where it's so big, so it's going to take multiple approaches.
Yeah, and for that same reason, it seems like a good example because yeah, there are a lot of paths being pursued right now, whether it's through the different rare campaigns and like you said, some of these other organizations and even some of the stuff I see World Wildlife Fund, I can see with that influence. So well, Dr. Kenny Wallen, really appreciate your time and your thoughts here, and thanks for speaking with us in our programming communications for conservation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.